moving on to photography, which most of you have already worked on the assignment already, since I'm working behind you. But we have to think about several issues, not only just the relationship between art and technology, but the act of making art and what exactly goes on with an artist's hands, with their mind, and with their eyes, because all are important to the creation of art and why we consider photography today part of the fine visual arts. So when asking art or technology, what we're really doing is working through the debate that people had during the 19th century when people like Daguerre and Talbot were filing their patents for their new devices and their new techniques of fixing, making permanent these images made with light, as photographs are. Many artists welcomed this new invention. They welcomed the aid to their own work. You can imagine a painter like Eakins on the right-hand side benefiting from documentation of early surgeries under ether, like we have here on the left, a daguerreotype. You can see too that, of course, an operation is something that involves movement. And a daguerreotype, though, any photograph really prefers lack of movement to make sure that everything is exposed properly. So some of the differences here between daguerreotype and painting that we're already seeing are sort of these kind of ghostly images here that are part of, the movement of light and the movement of the people themselves. On top of that, we're seeing textural differences. This is what we're seeing with the scratches, the grooves on the silver plate itself, where on the Eakins side, we're seeing paint and brushstroke on canvas, and that doesn't really necessarily interrupt our view the way that I think we might read the lines and textures of the photograph as noise, right? It's static. It's something to look past, look through, something that we would want to clear up in Photoshop, definitely. So that's what I'm talking about with, an artist's hands, an artist's eyes, an artist's mind. The choice of where to set the camera is a lot like the choice of, where to put the focus on the canvas. The choice of the angle of the camera to the viewer on top of that is a choice of perspective. It's a choice of foreshortening and illusionistic space. So many of the decisions that Eakins is making in his painting are also being made by Hawes, Southworth, Daguerre. All of these photographers are thinking of the same things. They are just using, in this case, chemicals and light to create their imagery. Then there are people like John Ruskin. Now, I don't want to expose too much of my bias against him. I have a watercolor in the center and then a photograph on the right-hand side of the seminal man in English art criticism, the first half of the 19th century especially. He's one who, he flip-flops, he changes his mind. At first he enjoys the idea of photography as an aid, a tool for artists. And of course he's engaged in photography in terms of his portrait there on the right. Though he also speaks against it as being an art in and of itself. He still sees it as secondary to painting, to drawing, to things actually done with the hand. And that involves a very particular, more philosophical movement that he is part of. The idea that arts and crafts, as the movement is named, things done by hand, made by hand, are ideal, are superior to things done by machine. So in Ruskin's view, he really kind of solidifies the side that rejects photography as an art because there's more being done by the eyes, by the chemicals, by the machinery in the process, rather than the hand holding a brush or a pencil, for example. And as you can see, though, it's right in front of him in his portrait versus his watercolor, how a photograph can imbue an image with the same level of value and contrast. It can reveal textures, not just of the paper itself, like with the daguerreotype plate, but with the textures of hair and cloth and wood and light and dark, and everything that we might praise a painter for is present in the photograph. And yet in the 1830s in France, this case of art or technology went all the way to the Supreme Court over whether or not photography needs a patent, which is usually for inventions and techniques, or copyright, which is more for works of art, paintings, works of literature, books. The question, therefore, is, before the court, what does Daguerre own? Does he own the technique, or does he own the daguerreotypes, named after him, that he creates with his technique? So ownership also is part of it. And as you can imagine, over the centuries, over the decades, photography has become accepted as something to be copywritten. Your work, if you put it up on Instagram, you want to protect it. You want to make sure that you share responsibly. Because even in this day and age of digital imagery, images, artistic work is still protected. And so I, as your teacher, use things pretty freely. If I weren't just teaching you guys, if I weren't just talking about it, if I was trying to make money off of these images, I wouldn't be able to use some of these images because they're restricted for commercial use. That's why with the book, our textbook, every now and then you might find a photograph that doesn't display. And that's because either the contract ran out on the agreement between the owner of the copyright and Cengage, our textbook publisher, to include that photograph in the online format as opposed to the print format. So this is what you were doing, talking about the impact of photography. And very personally, is photography art, is your photography art. So that's what I'm looking forward to reading this week, and what you think you yourselves do with your iPhones and your Androids versus what our photographers and our painters do in the textbook in terms of formal, visual elements of the composition, and also rhetorical things like emotions and symbolism, playing with the idea of real versus real, realist versus realistic. So the three basic types of photography kind of lead us through the development since the 1830s with the first one, Daguerre and his daguerreotype, to the calotype by Talbot, and then Nadar's wet plate system that is really the basis for the analog photography that at least your parents and grandparents know. Some of you might not have ever seen an analog camera, and that's disturbing a little bit. But go ahead and ask them about it. Ask them about the difference between analog and digital in terms of taking photos, and see what you think in terms of this image by Daumier, Nadar taking his work, his camera, up into the sky in a hot air balloon to record the cityscape of Paris. The advantage of wet plate photography compared to calotype and daguerreotype is that it is more portable. That's why we start to get traveling photographers and war photography and photography all across the globe as, again, the great empires of England, France, Germany, even America stretch across the rest of the world and their colonies and territories. What Nadar is creating here, a cityscape, a landscape, the genres are the same. Portraits, still life as well. Everything you can see on Daumier's lithograph here, it's a rather clever message because he's labeled all the buildings down there, photographie, 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 and the idea of Nadar raising photography to new heights, the height of art, literally in a hot air balloon, but also figuratively by creating the exact same genres, exact same images with his wet plate that you would see from a lithographer like Daumier, from a painter like Delacroix. All of this factors in the plus column, right? That yes, photography is fine art, and who cares what Ruskin thinks, right? Especially the French would have that opinion about the thought of an Englishman, definitely. So let's look at the work of Daguerre, Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre, and his still life in studio. So this is a rather early one, 1837, and the graininess that I've mentioned, the noise in this image, is in part the texture of the plate itself, which was coated in silver so that it reacts with the mercury vapor and is photo or light sensitive. We're also seeing the reflective qualities here that is, rather difficult to record. This is essentially a photograph of a photograph that we're looking at. Because, of course, the first imagery was in black and white, we have to think of it more like an etching or an engraving. This is a technique that is definitely dependent upon the contrast of textures, like I've mentioned before, but also values, lights and darks. So this is, if Leonardo could see this, this is a wonderful study, and chiaroscuro. This is a wonderful study that would help that Renaissance master perhaps perfect his sfumato, his smoky haziness that he shows in the Mona Lisa. On top of that, the choice of still life, these inanimate objects in his studio, you can see a couple either plaster or terracotta molds, little cherubs, angels, and photographs themselves, wine bottles. We don't have, say, the out-and-out symbolism necessarily of a Dutch still life from 2 centuries before, like Peter Clayt's Vanitas here. But we still have a play on permanence. If we can't quite say memento mori and reminder of death, we can at least talk about permanence and impermanence as opposed to life and death. These are things that had no problem standing still for the long exposure time. Nowadays we click and we record the image as fast as light can go. In Daguerre's experiments, in his early imagery, he would have to leave the shutter open for minutes, if not hours, to record this imagery. So we have a moment in his studio essentially frozen in time, like we talked about Clayt's and his reflection in that mirror ball, essentially freezing the artist and his art and his reputation in time, when the rest of the painting is about how things don't last forever, how things do go away and die and decay and break. The wonderful thing about photography, and this is a point that the video from the Eastman Center makes, imagine not knowing what your grandparents or great-grandparents really looked like, unless you're from a great grand family who can commission oil paintings. And on top of that, remember, Is the likeness true or flattering? There's a truth, a fact to photography that we couldn't always rely on painting for. And that's why I say real versus real. Both of these are real still lifes, right? The objects in them are real. One, though, is now paint on canvas, panel, excuse me. The other is light and dark on a silver plate. That's the real, the actual, the factual of it. Yet at one point, an artist sat with those images in front of him. The moment, as well, is real. So don't just fall into the trap that, oh, it's a photograph, therefore it's more real than the painting. Both of them are real artistic moments. One might rely more heavily on symbolism than the other. One might seem to us more immaterial because we don't necessarily consider the thing the photograph is on, right? The paper or the plate, or in our case, the pixels of the JPEG. Yet it's a way of preserving imagery. It's a way of preserving sight that, at least at first, took a while, not quite as long as it took someone to paint with oils, but Delacroix here had to sit for a while with his hands in his pockets, very still. That's why you tend to see people not smiling. They also invented back braces to hold people up during the long exposure times. And here, Delacroix was one of the artists who celebrated these new techniques, especially wet plate from his friend Nadar. And because, remember, artists have been using camera obscuras, they've been using lenses, they've been using projections of light to help them especially examine depth and examine the relationship of objects in real space. So this, for him, it wouldn't be something that's lesser than his own painting. He would have welcomed it. And, of course, with what Delacroix chooses to paint, he would have been in no danger of being run out of town or being run out of a job. What's the question now with all the automation? Are we all going to be out of a job and replaced by robots someday? I can see maybe a few people in the 1840s and 1850s worried about that. Portrait painters, perhaps. Yet, come on, there's always going to be oil painting. There's always going to be photography. Take Rembrandt versus Delacroix. Again, real versus real. Both men, real artists. The difference, of course, is Rembrandt is painting himself. It's an auto self-portrait. On the right, Delacroix is depicted by his friend. On the left, master of light and dark, all those lovely painterly brush strokes from the Dutch master. What does Nadar and other photographers do? They don't brush the paper. They expose it. They handle it. They rely on the texture not to get in the way and cause all that staticky noise, like on the daguerreotype. Or they welcome the statickiness, and the texture might lend to the work and make it a bit more abstract. Because we can appreciate the left as a true portrait, right? Despite the fuzziness, despite the fact that, here and there, the line between eye and nose is slightly blurred because of just how wonderfully Rembrandt would blend his paints. On the right-hand side, we can see some blurriness where, you can keep the man still for a couple minutes, but a slight breeze might blow the hair, or some of those finer details early photography might not yet be able to catch. So there's going to be flaws in both. These are works created by us, humans. We're imperfect. I think the important part is to realize that photography is not a thing in of itself. It's something operated by a person, operated by an artist, which is why I have you looking at your own snapshots. What were you thinking when you pressed that button? Did you use a filter? Did you crop it? Did you edit it at all? Make yourself a little blurrier to make yourself look better? Maybe. In terms of the rhetorical side of photography, this is where the type of paper, tissue paper for instance, something softer, something more delicate, and of course sepia development as opposed to just black and white, and that depends upon the paper chosen. Julia Margaret Cameron is able to create very dreamlike, metaphorical, allegorical photographs. She has the same artistic range as any painter. So she could snap the photo and leave it as is, the way Courbet would like, right? Realist with a big R. This is the way it is, warts and all. There's a good study. Take a picture of yourself, a selfie, and post it without editing it. Could you do it? Try it next time. Or Cameron can dress her model up, call her Ophelia. Remember Ophelia, painted by John Everett Millais. Allow the focus to blur, allow the paper to add its soft texture. And we have a sense of the character in a way, as if the painting and the photograph are related by this common literary source, right? As if the two are both adaptations, interpretations of Shakespeare's Hamlet and this preeminent female character from that work that would, at the time, in England especially, be so highly on demand, this nostalgia, for a great English writer, for great English literature, at a time when they're surrounded by so much that is new. This is Cameron proving that photography is not just new for new's sake, that it has the same rhetorical range. You can create symbolism, you can create abstraction, you can create the same levels of realism with a little r, and symbolism and romanticism. That I would kind of characterize her as a romantic, and at the very same time you're dealing with the same act, the click of the shutter that so many people think is better, easier, eventually quicker than an oil painting, cheaper, definitely. So once everybody starts getting their images recorded, fixed on paper, what's left for the artist to do? Remember, Vermeer on the left-hand side is famous for using the camera obscura. We have, some circumstantial evidence. He knew a friend of his was a great lens maker, and his extraordinary studies of depth and the diagonals of the black and white tiles on the floor there. We're looking at, as his mother-in-law called it, the allegory of the art of painting, with the muse Clio, with the artist himself, his back to us. There's so much more going on in this painting than in the photograph of Ophelia, right? We could still think of painting as the larger work. The Academy's in no danger here in the 1800s. There's still so much more poetic work for a whole canvas to do that, if we use the language of poetry, a photograph, you might say, is a single line, a single stanza, and maybe not a whole epic poem in of itself, just yet. It takes civil war in the United States and both the need and yearning for information about family members, husbands, brothers, sons, but at the same time, the horror of getting that information to really push photography into the realm of epic poetry, like I was saying. O'Sullivan's A Harvest of Death. Again, title chosen. He could have just said Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1863. Just the facts. A Harvest of Death adds that extra element. There's interpretation going on there. There's a bit of an editorial going on there if we think of it as newspaper, right? This is not just O'Sullivan reporting. This is O'Sullivan adding on, prompting the viewer. Before people really like O'Sullivan took their wet plate cameras out onto the field, you would get lithographs, engravings of troop movements along with the article in Harper's Weekly perhaps. But to get an actual photograph, that just compounds the realism. On top of that, O'Sullivan shows the aftermath of the battle. So Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Antietam is the bloodiest day, singular, but in total, Gettysburg is the one that really makes people stop on both sides. It's the reason why there's a campaign to create a cemetery there. That's why Lincoln goes there and delivers his famous Gettysburg Address. But before all that, there's this image. So what is being harvested? Those men in the background that you can just barely see on horseback. Because O'Sullivan has placed his camera on the ground itself. We have the same vantage point as the soldiers lying down. So that just makes the field look infinite. And so far away, those men are going through pockets. Best case scenario, they're getting letters for people and sending them onward. Worst case scenario, they're just taking money and gold and jewelry. The facts of war are right here in front of our faces because they were right there in front of O'Sullivan's lens. Notice how he lets the background, the horizon blur. We have this sharp focus, front and center. So there's an element of haziness, maybe a little bit of mystery. There, I know in the upper left, can you see the remnants of a thumbprint even? A harvest of death. They're harvesting items, things. Certainly at this stage in the war, people would be harvesting boots, equipment, ammunition. Along with identifying, the harvest is a human harvest. The humanity of war here, without any political rhetoric able to overshadow it. That is what the photographer delivers. Compare, as the book does, to Winslow Homer's painting. We have the same rhetorical use, the metaphor of the field and harvest. So pretty much the exact same metaphor in different forms. Photograph on the left, painting on the right. We see the harvested on the left, the harvester on the right. What else is different? What we read as quick, sharp brush strokes on Winslow Homer's side, that's just the way the grass is, right? I'm taking us back to real versus real. Think of all the work to cover that painting, cover that canvas that Homer did. What work does O'Sullivan do? Click. Is that all? He has the whole field in front of him. He chose where to start, where to stop, the left side, the right side. He chose where to set the camera. All of that is akin to covering the canvas. And yeah, think practically. Out in a war zone, at the end of a battle, O'Sullivan's going to take his equipment and take his photograph. Homer's probably not going to be as welcome with his canvas and his paints and all of his supplies he would need to paint a painting right then and there. But we'll get to that with chapter 28. There's an aspect of witnessing to O'Sullivan that we don't necessarily get from Homer. But both of them have an understanding of what they are painting or what they are displaying, depicting. The way that Daumier also had an understanding, even if he wasn't an eyewitness, of the massacre at Rue Transnonain. So look at the relationship between these, photograph and lithograph. One on the left means, from the Greek, simply a light drawing. On the right, stone drawing. We have the mark of Daumier's hand, the crayon that he used to put this image on the stone. The mark of the hand, not the thumbprint in this case, is the way the camera's aimed. And how it is aimed. What he chose to show you. Notice how O'Sullivan's taken away a lot of maybe the more dramatic tools, like the diagonals and the cropping of the older man and what we might read as the mother or the wife over here. We don't have an endless field of people on the right-hand side, so we have a single moment by Daumier and eternity, it might seem, on O'Sullivan's side because of this repetition of multiple horizontals all the way back into infinity. So that's, I'll bring back Hawes and Southworth here. So that's the artistic notion of photography and how it is used. Here you can imagine that doctors are used to, these gentlemen are used to getting a portrait painted. In this case, perhaps like with O'Sullivan, an operating room isn't the best place for someone to set up their easel. But gentlemen can set up their camera and use the wet plate system, or in this case, daguerreotype, and rely on still poses, as still as they can be. And notice they're not recording a moment of the surgery. These are all pretty much just posed, gathered. And you can see who's better at standing still than others, who's blurrier. So we have this guy moving a little bit. So not quite the moment of incision or the moment of lecture that we get from Eakins. This is posed, planned, more of the journalistic side of photography that many people point to as not a way of denigrating it, but to show just how versatile the camera can be. By 1878, after decades after Daguerre, decades after Talbot and his calotype, decades of wet plate photography and using negatives to process positive images, Muybridge, actually influenced by a bet made with the California governor, studies movement of animals. In this case, the idea is, well, during a gallop, are all four hooves off the ground? And take a look at these frames here. Oh, frames 2 and 3. What he's also studying, though, what he continues to study here in America, he's English, but he comes over here, is the basis for video, the basis for the movies, motion pictures. Because each of these frames is a photograph. And yet string them together and you have the sequence of galloping. So this is a moment in the end of the century where science and art seem to have come back together again. There was debate beginning in the 1830s about whether they deserved copyright. There was a debate about whether or not this is art or not. And now this is the photograph assisting the development of a new art form. Film. Cinema. Because people like Muybridge, both photographer and scientist, look at it in a more practical way that artists can then take, think of your favorite film, create into an epic work of art based on the fact that our eyes, if we look at these images quickly enough, will read it as continuous motion. We won't think of it as a slideshow or frame to frame to frame of a horse galloping. We'll think of it, that's just a horse galloping, if you show it to us fast enough. And that's what a film does. It relies on the persistence of vision. So everything from Disney's Snow White to the Avengers starts here in the 19th century with Muybridge and the photographers simply figuring out how to make those projected images of light permanent, fix them. And now, after so much has been done to make them still, now they need to make them move. So we'll talk more about that, definitely, as we get into the turn of the 19th century.